Hello and welcome. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story, The Endless Corridor. The sound of buzzing lights filled Evan's ears. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him notice it right away. He blinked a few times, his eyes adjusting to the bright, white light above him. He realized he was lying on the floor, which felt cold and hard. He touched it with his hand. It was smooth, like the linoleum you'd find in a school or hospital. He sat up, his head spinning. The air smelled like cleaning products, sharp and sterile. The room around him was plain and empty. The walls were white, and there was only one desk with a single chair. On the desk, there was a phone. It didn't look normal. It was flat and dark, without any buttons. Evan got to his feet and walked over to the phone. When he touched it, the screen lit up. Big words appeared. "Do not leave the corridor." His stomach twisted, and his hands started to shake. He backed away from the desk, staring at the message. The words vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the screen black again. Evan turned around, looking for answers, but there was nothing else in the room. Just the desk, the chair, and that single door on the far wall. He couldn't remember how he got here. The last thing he remembered was driving home from work. It had been raining, and the road was slick. Then nothing. His memory was blank after that. Evan walked to the door. It was wooden, with a small glass window at the top. The glass was frosted, so he couldn't see clearly through it, but he could tell there was a hallway on the other side. He grabbed the doorknob. It felt cool in his hand, and when he turned it, there was a loud click. The hallway stretched out before him. It was long, far too long. The ceiling lights flickered slightly, casting weird shadows on the walls. There were doors lining both sides of the corridor. They all looked the same, plain, with no signs or labels. Evan's throat felt dry. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the faint hum of the lights above. He took a step forward, then another, his footsteps echoing strangely. The air felt heavy, as though the hallway itself was pressing down on him. "Okay," he said to himself, trying to stay calm. "It's just a building. I'll find a way out." He picked one of the doors at random and opened it. Inside was another hallway. It looked exactly like the one he had just left. Evan frowned and stepped inside, hoping this would lead somewhere new. He walked for several minutes, but it didn't take long for him to realize he was back where he started. Or at least, it felt like he was. "No, no, no," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "This doesn't make sense." A sound made him freeze. It was faint at first, like someone whispering far away. He turned his head, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound was coming from one of the doors ahead. His heartbeat quickened as he moved closer. The whispering got louder. He couldn't make out what the voices were saying, but it sounded like more than one person, many voices, all speaking at once. He hesitated at the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. Slowly, he pushed the door open. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing on the other side was himself. Another Evan, staring back at him with the same confused, scared expression. Evan stumbled backward, his mouth hanging open. What is this?" The other Evan didn't speak. It tilted its head, mirroring his movements. Then it smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp. The teeth looked wrong, like something out of a nightmare. "Who are you?" Evan shouted, his voice shaking. The other Evan stepped forward, its smile growing wider. Evan's heart pounded as he backed away. Then suddenly, the other Evan lunged at him. Evan turned and ran, his breath coming in short gasps. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how fast he ran, the sound of footsteps stayed close behind him. He yanked open another door and slammed it shut behind him, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. This room was different. It was bigger, and the walls were covered in mirrors. Evan froze when he looked into them. In each mirror, he saw a different version of himself. One was crying, clawing at his face until it bled. Another stood completely still, his eyes black and empty. A third was smiling that horrible, wide smile with teeth that looked sharp enough to bite through steel. Evan's knees felt weak. He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "This isn't real. This isn't real." When he opened his eyes again, the mirrors were empty. The room looked normal, if you could call anything about this place normal. Then a soft laugh echoed around him. It wasn't his laugh. It was low and chilling, coming from somewhere close. "Who's there?" Evan shouted, spinning around. The laugh grew louder, filling the room. A deep voice whispered in his ear, "Welcome." Evan screamed. Evan's scream echoed in the empty room, but the voice was gone as quickly as it had come. He stood there, trembling, staring at the mirrors as if they might come alive again. The silence pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. His chest heaved as he tried to calm down, but every nerve in his body screamed that he wasn't safe here. He turned toward the door he'd come through. Maybe if he just kept moving, he'd find a way out. But as he reached for the knob, he froze. There was something written on the door now, scrawled in what looked like black ink. Or was it something darker? "You can't run forever." Evan's mouth went dry. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before he yanked it open. The corridor outside was the same as before, long, dimly lit, and lined with identical doors. The hum of the lights was louder now, almost like a swarm of insects buzzing just above his head. He stepped out, glancing over his shoulder one last time. The words on the door were gone. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He kept his eyes on the doors, trying to remember which ones he had already opened. But they all looked the same. Every step he took felt like it carried him deeper into a maze he'd never escape. "Think, Evan," he whispered to himself. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." He stopped in front of another door, hesitating. What would be behind this one? Another version of himself? More mirrors? Or something worse? He took a deep breath and turned the knob. The room inside was small and dimly lit, with walls painted a sickly yellow. A single table stood in the center, and on the table was a stack of photographs. Evan stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He picked up the top photo, and his heart sank. It was a picture of him, sitting at his desk at work. He remembered that day clearly. He'd been eating lunch while going through emails. But how was this photo here? Who had taken it? He flipped to the next one. It was another photo of him, this time driving his car in the rain. Then another, him unlocking his front door. The photos continued, each one showing a moment from his life, captured from angles he couldn't explain. Some were mundane, like brushing his teeth or watching TV. But as he got further down the stack, the images became darker. One showed him lying in bed, staring at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes. Another showed him standing in an empty hallway. This hallway, with that awful smiling version of himself standing just behind him. Evan dropped the photos and backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "No, no, no," he muttered. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The lights in the room flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye. He spun around, but the room was empty. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran back into the corridor, slamming the door behind him. The hallway was no longer silent. He could hear faint whispers again, coming from somewhere up ahead. They were joined by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Evan's pulse raced as he looked around, trying to figure out which direction the sounds were coming from. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Hello!" The footsteps stopped. The whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't quite make out. They sounded like his name, repeated over and over in a low, rasping voice. Evan bolted down the hallway, not caring where he was going. He just needed to get away. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that made no sense. At times, it felt like he was running in circles, but he didn't dare stop to check. He opened door after door, but each one led to more hallways, more empty rooms, more confusion. Finally, he stumbled into a room that wasn't like the others. It was pitch black, with no lights or windows. He could feel the darkness pressing against him, heavy and suffocating. He fumbled for the door, but it had vanished. He was trapped. A voice broke the silence, deep and mocking. "You're getting closer, Evan. Do you feel it?" Evan spun around, but he couldn't see anything. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice laughed, low and menacing. "I'm what's left when you stop running. I'm the part of you that you can't escape. Leave me alone." Evan shouted, his voice shaking. "I don't belong here." The voice didn't respond, but suddenly the room was filled with the sound of footsteps. Hundreds of them coming from every direction. Evan clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block out the noise. He sank to the floor, curling into himself as the sound grew louder and louder. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Evan opened his eyes and found himself back in the corridor. He was lying on the floor, staring up at the flickering lights. The hallway was empty again, but something had changed. The doors were no longer plain. Each one had a small, brass plaque on it with a name engraved. Evan's name. He stumbled to his feet, staring at the nearest door. It read, Evan version 4. He looked at the next door. Evan version 12. And the next. Evan version 27. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the entire hallway was lined with versions of himself. Evan stared at the plaques, his hands trembling. Each door was labeled with a version of him, climbing higher and higher in number. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked down the hallway, his eyes darting from one door to the next. Version 38, version 52, version 103. The numbers didn't make sense. How many versions of him could there be? He reached out and touched one of the plaques. It felt cold, like metal left out in the snow. Why? He whispered to himself. Why is this happening? As if in answer, one of the doors creaked open behind him. Evan whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. The door, marked version 11, swung open just enough for him to see inside. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to walk away, but his legs moved on their own. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were alive. At the center of the room stood a figure. It was him, but not quite. This version of him looked gaunt and pale, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken and rimmed with dark shadows, and his clothes hung loosely from his frame, as though he hadn't eaten in weeks. The other Evan lifted his head slowly, his hollow eyes locking onto him. "You're wasting time," the figure said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evan froze. "Wasting time? What are you talking about?" "You'll never leave," the figure said, taking a shaky step forward. "You think you can find a way out, but there isn't one. You'll keep running, and running, until there's nothing left of you." "No," Evan said, shaking his head. "That's not true. I'll find a way. There has to be a way out of here." The other Evan smiled faintly, but it was a sad smile full of pity. "That's what I said. A long time ago." Evan backed out of the room, slamming the door shut before the figure could say anything else. His heart raced as he leaned against the door, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't let himself believe what that version of him had said. There had to be a way out. He turned back to the hallway and kept walking. His footsteps echoed loudly, each one reminding him how alone he was. He tried not to look at the doors anymore, but it was impossible to ignore the plaques. The numbers kept climbing. Version 200, version 324, version 500. Finally, he stopped in front of a door with no number on it. It was plain and unmarked, different from all the others. His hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure if he should open it. The air around him felt different here, heavier, almost electric. He took a deep breath and turned the knob. The room inside was massive, far larger than it should have been. It stretched out endlessly, with no walls or ceiling in sight. The floor was smooth and reflective, like black glass. In the center of the room stood a tall mirror, framed in dark wood. Evan approached it cautiously. His reflection stared back at him, but it didn't move when he did. "Hello, Evan," the reflection said, its voice calm and cold. Evan stumbled back. What are you?" The reflection smiled, tilting its head. "I'm you. Or at least, the part of you that's been waiting for this moment." "This moment?" Evan repeated, his voice shaking. The reflection nodded. "You've been running from yourself, haven't you? Running from your fears, your regrets, your failures. But no matter how far you run, you always end up back here. With me." "That's not true," Evan shouted. "I'm not running from anything. I just want to get out of here." The reflection laughed softly, the sound echoing through the endless room. "You still don't understand, do you? There is no out. This place is you. Every hallway, every door, every version of yourself you've seen. It's all a part of you." Evan's legs felt weak, and he sank to the floor. "No," he whispered. "That can't be true. This is just some kind of nightmare. I'll wake up, and it'll all be over." The reflection stepped out of the mirror, its movements smooth and unnatural. It crouched in front of him, its dark eyes boring into his. "Do you want to wake up?" it asked softly. "Do you want this to end?" Evan nodded desperately. "Yes. Please, just let me go." The reflection's smile widened, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "Then stop running. Accept it. Accept me." Evan stared at the figure, his mind racing. Was that the answer? Was this place really a part of him? And if it was, could he face it? The reflection reached out a hand, waiting for him to take it. Evan hesitated, staring at the reflection's outstretched hand. His fingers twitched, instinct pulling him back, but something deeper whispered to him. If he didn't take that hand, if he didn't face this, he'd be stuck here forever. The reflection tilted its head, its smile never faltering. "What's wrong, Evan? You wanted answers. You wanted an escape. This is it." Evan swallowed hard. "How do I know this isn't another trick? Another trap?" The reflection chuckled softly, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness. "You don't. But ask yourself, has running helped you? Has slamming doors and screaming into empty hallways changed anything? You've seen where that leads." Evan thought of the other versions of himself, the hollow-eyed man, the smiling monster, the whispers that followed him wherever he went. He thought of the photos on the table, the endless corridors, the futility of it all. The reflection was right. Running had only led him deeper into the maze. "What happens if I take your hand?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The reflection's smile grew wider, though it didn't answer the question directly. "You'll find out." Evan's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Everything in him screamed to turn away, to find another door, to keep moving. But where would that lead? More fear? More confusion? Slowly, reluctantly, he reached out and grasped the reflection's hand. The moment their hands touched, the room exploded with light. Evan squeezed his eyes shut as the brightness seared into his vision. He felt like he was falling, his stomach lurching as the ground disappeared beneath him. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the dark, endless room. He was sitting at his desk. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead was familiar, almost comforting. His computer screen glowed in front of him, displaying a half-written email. The office around him was quiet, the soft tapping of keyboards and muffled conversations filling the air. For a moment, Evan felt a wave of relief. He was back. It was over. But then he noticed something strange. The email on his screen, it wasn't one he remembered writing. The subject line read, "Do not leave." The body of the email was blank, except for a single line of text. "You're still here, Evan." His heart skipped a beat. He looked around the office, his co-workers seemingly oblivious to his panic. They were all familiar faces, people he'd worked with for years. But something was off. Their movements were too stiff, too synchronized. "Hey, Evan," a voice said, startling him. He turned to see Michael, the guy who worked in the cubicle next to his. Michael was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp, just like the reflection in the mirror. "You okay, buddy?" Michael asked, his tone light and casual, though his smile never wavered. Evan pushed back his chair, his palms sweating. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Michael nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Evan's. "You should take a break. Maybe go for a walk." The word sent a chill down Evan's spine. The memory of the endless hallway flashed in his mind, the doors with his name, the other versions of himself. "I'm good," Evan said quickly, standing up. "I just need some air." He grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator, his pulse racing. As he stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, he realized he was holding his breath. The elevator doors slid shut, and he felt a small sense of relief as it began to descend. But then the lights flickered. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not again." The elevator jerked to a stop. The overhead light dimmed, leaving him in near darkness. He pressed the buttons frantically, but none of them responded. A low hum filled the air, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. He covered his ears, but the sound seemed to be inside his head. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a hallway. It was the same hallway, the long, endless corridor lined with doors. Evan staggered back, shaking his head. "No! I got out! I got out!" The hum faded, replaced by whispers. They came from every direction, growing louder with each passing second. "You're still here, Evan. You can't leave. You never left." Evan collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers consumed him. The hallway seemed to stretch and twist, the walls pulsing like a living thing. Through the chaos, one door stood out. It was the only one with no plaque, no number. Just a plain, unmarked door at the end of the corridor. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. With shaky legs, he forced himself to stand. The whispers grew louder, almost screaming now, but he ignored them. Step by step, he made his way to the door. When he reached it, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the knob, his heart pounding. "What's behind this one?" he whispered to himself. The door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness. Evan took a deep breath and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed him whole as soon as he crossed the threshold. It was thick and impenetrable, like stepping into an abyss. Evan couldn't see his own hands in front of his face, no matter how hard he strained his eyes. The air was heavy, damp, and carried a faint metallic scent. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. The darkness answered with silence. He took another step, and then another, each one cautious and uncertain. His footsteps didn't echo like they should have. It was as if the space absorbed every sound, leaving nothing behind. A faint light appeared in the distance, barely more than a pinprick, but it was enough to give him hope. He moved toward it, quickening his pace. As he got closer, he realized the light was coming from another door, identical to the one he had just walked through. His relief was short-lived. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step he took. "You're wasting your time. There's nothing here for you. Turn back." He pressed on, ignoring the voices, though his hands trembled with every step. When he reached the door, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the knob and pulled it open. The room on the other side was small, almost claustrophobic. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting him from a slightly different angle. In the center of the room was a single chair. Sitting in the chair was another version of himself, but this one was older. His hair was streaked with gray, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. His eyes, however, were the same as Evan's, wide and filled with fear. The older Evan looked up at him, his expression weary. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice hoarse. Evan stared at him, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" The older man laughed bitterly. Isn't it obvious? I'm you. Or what's left of you. No, Evan said, shaking his head. I don't understand. What is this place? Why am I here? The older man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. This place is a reflection of you. Your choices, your fears, your regrets. Every door you've opened, every version of yourself you've seen. It's all you, Evan. And the more you run, the more trapped you become. Evan clenched his fists. There has to be a way out. There has to be. The older man sighed. There is, but it's not what you think. He gestured to the mirrors surrounding them. Look at them. Really look. Evan hesitated, then turned to face the mirrors. At first, he saw only his reflection, but as he looked closer, he noticed the differences. Some versions of him were smiling, but their smiles were cold and unnatural. Others looked broken, their eyes hollow and empty. What is this? Evan whispered. These are your choices, the older man said. Every decision you've made, every path you've taken has led to this. Some of them were mistakes. Others were lies you told yourself. And now you're stuck here, facing all of it. Evan's chest tightened. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to escape. The older man's gaze was piercing. Escape from what? Your life? Your regrets. You think you can just run away from everything that haunts you. Evan turned away from the mirrors, his hands shaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. No one ever does, the older man said. But the only way out is through. Evan looked at him, his voice trembling. What does that mean? What do I have to do? The older man stood slowly, his movements deliberate. You have to face it. All of it. The fear, the pain, the regret. You can't keep running, Evan. Not anymore. The room seemed to grow darker, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. The mirrors shimmered, and for a moment, Evan saw something moving within them, shadows, twisting and writhing. The older man placed a hand on Evan's shoulder, his grip firm. Are you ready? Evan swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he didn't have a choice. I'm ready, he said, his voice barely audible. The older man nodded. Then step through. He pointed to one of the mirrors. The glass rippled like water, and Evan felt a strange pull, as if it was calling to him. With trembling hands, he reached out and touched the surface. It was cold and smooth, but as he pressed his hand against it, it gave way, pulling him in. The world spun around him, a whirlwind of light and shadow, whispers and screams. He felt like he was falling, but there was no ground, no end to the descent. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Evan found himself standing in a room that was both familiar and alien. It was his office, but it wasn't. The walls were warped, the furniture twisted into impossible shapes. His reflection stared back at him from every surface, but it wasn't just one version of him. It was all of them, layered on top of each other like a kaleidoscope of faces. You've made it, a voice said, echoing all around him. Evan turned, but there was no one there. What now? He asked, his voice trembling. The voice chuckled, low and menacing. Now you decide. Do you face the truth, or do you keep running? Evan stood frozen, the question reverberating in his mind. His breaths were shallow, and sweat trickled down his temples. The voices had quieted now, leaving only an oppressive silence that felt heavier than the whispers. Face the truth or keep running, Evan repeated under his breath, his voice cracking. What truth? What do you mean? The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, the mirrored reflections around him began to shift. Each version of him stepped closer to the surface, their faces pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. Their mouths moved, but their words were silent. Evan backed away, his gaze darting between the reflections. Stop it! Stop doing that, he shouted, but the faces didn't stop. Then one of them spoke. You know what it is, said a reflection with hollow eyes and bloodied hands. You've always known. No, I don't. Evan yelled, shaking his head. I don't know anything. I didn't ask for this. Another reflection, this one with a twisted smile, leaned closer. It doesn't matter what you asked for. You're here because you chose to be. Evan's stomach turned. Chose? What are you talking about? I didn't choose this. Oh, but you did, said another reflection, this one covered in bruises and cuts. Every lie, every denial, every time you turned your back on the truth, you brought yourself here. The room began to change again, the mirrors melting away to reveal fragments of scenes. Evan saw flashes of his past, moments he had tried to forget, moments he had buried deep. He saw himself standing outside his father's hospital room, refusing to go inside. He heard the harsh words he had spoken to his mother during a fight, words he could never take back. He saw the email he had ignored from an old friend who had needed help, an email he never responded to because he was too busy. No, Evan whispered, his knees buckling. He sank to the ground, clutching his head. Stop it! I don't want to see this. But you must, the voice said, now calm and measured. You can't move forward until you face what you've been running from. The fragments kept coming, one after another, each more painful than the last. He saw the missed opportunities, the broken relationships, the moments of cowardice and fear. Tears streamed down his face as he screamed, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry for all of it. What more do you want from me? The scenes vanished, leaving him alone in the empty, twisted room. A single reflection remained, standing in front of him. It looked like him, but there was no malice in its expression. Instead, its eyes were filled with something else, understanding, maybe even compassion. It's not about what I want, the reflection said softly. It's about what you're willing to do. Are you ready to stop running? To accept everything that you are, the good and the bad? Evan looked up at the reflection, his body trembling. And what happens if I do? The reflection smiled faintly. You'll see. Evan closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He thought about all the moments he had just witnessed, all the pain and guilt he had carried for so long. He thought about the endless hallways, the versions of himself, the doors that led nowhere. And then slowly he opened his eyes. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady. The reflection nodded. Then stepped forward. Evan stood on unsteady legs, his heart pounding. He walked toward the reflection, unsure of what would happen next. As he reached out to touch it, the reflection did the same, their hands meeting in the glass. A blinding light filled the room, and Evan felt himself being pulled again, as though he were being torn apart and put back together all at once. When the light faded, he was standing in his office again. But this time it was different. The room was normal, no twisted walls, no strange reflections, no oppressive whispers. His computer screen showed a blank document, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was comforting. Evan looked around, his heart still racing. Was it over? Had he finally escaped? A soft knock at his cubicle wall made him jump. He turned to see Michael standing there, smiling. Not the unsettling, sharp smile he had seen before, but a genuine one. Hey, Evan, Michael said. You coming to lunch? We're all heading down to that new place around the corner. Evan hesitated, his mind racing. But then he nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. Yeah, I'll come. As he stood up and grabbed his jacket, he felt a strange sense of peace. The memories of the hallway, the mirrors, and the voices were still there, but they no longer held the same power over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't running anymore. Evan followed Michael out of the office, his footsteps steady but his mind still a swirl of uncertainty. The air in the hallway felt lighter, less oppressive than it had before, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. They stepped into the elevator together, joined by a few other co-workers. The casual chatter and soft laughter of his colleagues felt normal, comforting, even. But Evan couldn't ignore the nagging sensation in the back of his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. The elevator doors closed, and the familiar hum of motion filled the small space. Evan glanced at the floor indicator. watching the numbers tick downward. "Excited for lunch?" Michael asked, breaking the silence. Evan forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. I could use a break." Michael chuckled. "You and me both. It's been a long week, huh?" Evan nodded, but his attention was drawn back to the floor indicator. It had stopped at the ground floor, but the elevator didn't open. The hum continued, and the sensation of movement persisted. "Did we pass the lobby?" Evan asked, his voice tinged with unease. Michael frowned, glancing at the indicator. The other co-workers exchanged confused looks. "Must be a glitch," Michael said, reaching for the panel. He pressed the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. The elevator kept moving. This is weird," one of the co-workers muttered, their voice nervous. Evan's chest tightened as the floor numbers began to climb instead of descend. First, they ticked up slowly, 2, 3, 4. Then they began to blur, the numbers changing too quickly to track. "Okay, what's going on?" Michael said, his voice rising in panic. The elevator lights flickered, and the chatter in the small space turned to panicked murmurs. Evan pressed himself against the wall, his breath quickening. "This can't be happening again," he whispered to himself, gripping the railing tightly. A sudden jolt shook the elevator, sending everyone stumbling. The lights went out entirely, plunging them into complete darkness. "Is everyone okay?" Michael called out, his voice strained. "I think so," someone replied, their voice trembling. Before anyone could say more, the elevator shuddered to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of shallow breathing. And then the whispers returned. Evan's blood ran cold as the faint, familiar voices seeped into the elevator. They came from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder with every passing second. "You're still running, Evan. You can't escape. This isn't over." "No," Evan shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I faced it. I did what you wanted." The whispers laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "Did you?" they taunted. "Or did you just take the easy way out?" The elevator doors suddenly slid open, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. It wasn't the lobby. It wasn't anywhere Evan recognized. Michael and the others stared at the hallway in confusion and fear. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. Evan knew. He didn't want to, but he knew. It was the hallway, the endless corridor that had haunted him, twisted and alive. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I'm not going back." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air in the elevator felt suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. "You have to go, Evan," the voices said. "You're not done yet." "No," he shouted, slamming his fists against the wall. "I'm done. I faced everything. I'm done." The hallway seemed to stretch closer, the shadows within it writhing like living things. Michael grabbed Evan's arm, his face pale. "What's happening, man? What is this?" Evan shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. I don't know." The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows spilled into the elevator, wrapping around Evan like tendrils. He screamed, struggling against them, but they pulled him toward the hallway. "No! Let me go! I'm done!" The others in the elevator watched in horror, their faces frozen in shock as Evan was dragged out of the elevator and into the corridor. The last thing he saw before the doors slammed shut was Michael's terrified face. And then he was alone. The hallway stretched before him, endless and oppressive. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Evan staggered to his feet, his body trembling. "Why?" he shouted into the emptiness. "Why are you doing this to me?" The only response was a faint echo of his own voice. He turned to look behind him, but the elevator was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, with no doors, no windows, just a long, barren path. Evan took a shaky step forward, then another. The silence was unbearable, pressing down on him like a weight. But as he walked, he noticed something strange. The walls of the hallway began to change, shifting and warping. Images appeared, fragments of his life, moments he had long forgotten. A birthday party when he was 6, the smell of candles and the sound of laughter. The day he graduated college, standing proud in his cap and gown. The first time he held his niece, her tiny hand gripping his finger. Tears streamed down his face as he walked, the memories overwhelming him. And then the images shifted. He saw the moments of pain and regret, the fights, the failures, the times he had hurt the people he cared about. Evan fell to his knees, sobbing. "What do you want from me?" he cried. "What do I have to do?" The hallway didn't answer. It simply stretched on, waiting. Evan sat there for what felt like hours, the hallway surrounding him in its unending silence. His breaths were shallow, each one rattling his chest. The images on the walls didn't stop. They played over and over, each more agonizing than the last. Every time he thought he had moved past the memories, another would appear, more failure, more guilt. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. What had he missed? What was the next step? But as he looked down at his hands, he realized something. They were trembling. His entire body was shaking uncontrollably, as if the fear was no longer just in his mind, but in every part of him. Then in the distance, he heard something. A soft sound at first, like a whisper of footsteps. Evan's head snapped up. His eyes scanned the dark, stretching hallway ahead. There was no one there, no one he could see anyway. The whispering footsteps continued, though, growing louder with each passing second. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. Evan stood slowly, his legs unsteady, and began walking down the corridor, the distant sound of footsteps still echoing in his mind. He didn't want to keep walking. His legs felt like lead, his body weighed down by the tension of it all. But the need to move, to find something, anything that would make sense of this nightmare, pushed him forward. As he moved further into the darkness, the walls around him began to change. The smooth, empty surface turned into something more organic. The walls began to pulse as if breathing. The dim light above flickered erratically, casting long, stretching shadows that danced like figures on the edges of his vision. He froze, his heart racing. Suddenly, a door appeared. It was nothing like the others he had seen. This one wasn't just a regular door in the hallway. It was old, splintered, the wood dark and weathered with age. A single rusty doorknob stood out, as though inviting him to enter. The footsteps had stopped. Everything was still again. Evan swallowed hard. He was terrified, but the pull of the door was stronger than his fear. It felt different, like it was the next part of this twisted game he had been thrust into. He reached out with trembling fingers, grasping the knob. It turned easily in his hand, and the door creaked open with a low, groaning sound. Inside, the room was dark, and the air smelled of dust and something foul. A low, steady hum filled the room, vibrating in the walls and floor. Evan stepped inside, squinting in the dim light. The room was filled with large, heavy shapes, their outlines barely visible in the shadows. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them, figures. Figures standing motionless in the corners of the room, their bodies cloaked in darkness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Evan knew they were watching him. He could feel their eyes on him, even if he couldn't see their faces. Evan's breath caught in his throat. Who are you?" he whispered. The figures remained silent. The hum grew louder. It vibrated through his bones, like a force he couldn't escape. The more he tried to focus on the figures, the more they seemed to blur, as if his mind couldn't fully comprehend their presence. He stepped forward, his feet reluctant to move. The silence was suffocating. The humming was the only thing that filled the room now, so loud it felt like it was crawling inside his skull. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. Evan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move like a person. It wasn't smooth or natural. It jerked forward, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. Its form wavered, like a mirage, as though it was caught between two realities. "No," Evan gasped. "No, please." But the figure kept coming, slowly, deliberately. And then, just as it reached him, it stopped. For a long moment, the room was still again. Then, without warning, the figure spoke. "You're not done yet." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. His head spun, and he couldn't breathe. The figure's voice was cold, distant, and yet somehow familiar. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, a motion that seemed wrong, like the bones inside it were snapping out of place. "I am you." Evan's stomach turned. "What do you mean? What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You know what you've done. You know what you've hidden from yourself." Evan shook his head. "I don't understand." "You will," the figure said, its voice now a whisper. "But first, you must face what you've been running from." The humming intensified, vibrating the walls and floor around him. The figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy as it touched his arm. Evan recoiled, but the figure's grip tightened. Its touch felt like ice crawling under his skin, leaving an unnatural chill in its wake. Then the world around him seemed to shift. The walls of the room cracked, splintering like glass, and the floor beneath him tilted. "Wake up," the figure said, its voice now a screeching whisper. "Wake up and face the truth." Evan's body lurched as the ground gave way beneath him. He tumbled forward, falling into the darkness once more, his scream swallowed by the abyss. Evan's body slammed against something hard. He gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he lay there, disoriented. For a moment, the darkness engulfed him entirely, and all he could hear was the rush of his own heartbeat in his ears. Then slowly, the world around him began to shift again. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, and the air grew colder, carrying a faint, musty odor. Evan forced himself to sit up, his hands scraping against the rough, uneven surface beneath him. It felt like stone. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the haze, but the darkness still held him in its grasp. "What is happening?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Where am I?" He pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He could barely make out his surroundings, but something in the air felt wrong. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the steady dripping of water, which seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the darkness. The smell of decay lingered in the air, thick and heavy. He took a step forward, then another, his feet dragging as he walked, uncertain of where he was going. His hand brushed against something cold and wet. It was a wall, smooth, slick with moisture. He recoiled, shivering as his skin crawled. "What is this place?" he whispered. The silence seemed to answer him with its own strange kind of voice, the soft, echoing drip of water, the sound like a slow ticking clock, reminding him of the time that had slipped away. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The endless hallways, the distorted versions of himself, the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. But now, everything felt even more twisted. It was like he had fallen into another layer of this nightmare, deeper and darker than before. As he stumbled forward, the walls seemed to shift around him. They weren't just stone anymore. The surface was rough, jagged, as though they were growing alive. He could feel them shift, like the room itself was breathing, pulsating, responding to his every move. His eyes widened with terror as he realized he wasn't alone. The whispering began again. It was faint at first, just a murmur, like the voices of hundreds of people all speaking at once. But as it grew louder, he began to make out the words. "You cannot escape. You will never escape. You belong to us now." The words sent a chill down his spine, and Evan's steps faltered. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. He couldn't even see where he had come from anymore. With every passing moment, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They surrounded him, their voices twisting together into a cacophony of madness. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Evan shouted, his voice cracking. A cold laugh echoed in the darkness, and Evan spun around, searching for the source. But all he saw was the swirling blackness around him, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. "You brought this upon yourself," one voice whispered, sharp and accusing. "You ran, and now you cannot hide." "No!" Evan screamed, his fists clenched. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose this." "You chose long ago," the voice replied, cold and unforgiving. "Every step you took, every choice you made, led you here. You can't escape the truth. Not now. Not ever." Suddenly, the darkness in front of him began to shift. Figures emerged from the shadows, just like before. But these weren't just twisted reflections. These were real. They were him. Evan staggered backward, his heart racing as he saw the versions of himself standing before him. Each one slightly different, but all wearing the same tortured expression. Some had bloodied hands. Others had hollow eyes. Some were smiling, twisted grins stretching across their faces. But all of them shared the same unmistakable trait. They were him. Every single one. "You can't run from yourself, Evan," one of the figures said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "No," Evan whispered, his breath catching in his throat. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The figures closed in on him, their steps slow but deliberate. Evan took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The room had no corners, no exits, just endless, shifting darkness and the presence of these twisted versions of himself. "You've always been this way," another version of himself spoke. This one's face was covered in bruises, its eyes lifeless. "You've always turned away when it got hard. When it got real." Evan's chest tightened as the weight of the words hit him. He had turned away. He had avoided the difficult truths. He had run again and again, thinking he could escape the consequences. "You think you can just walk away?" the first figure asked, its voice seeping into Evan's thoughts. "No, you can't. You have to face what you've done." The others stepped forward, and Evan felt the cold grip of panic seize his chest. "No, please," he cried. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." But the figures only stared at him, their eyes hollow and unblinking. "You're not sorry enough," one of them sneered. "You haven't changed. You haven't faced it. You haven't faced what you've hidden from yourself." Evan fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he pressed them to his face. "I don't know how," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to face it." "You will," another figure said, its voice cold but firm. "But only when you stop running." Evan's breath hitched, his mind spiraling into a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He didn't know what they meant. He didn't know what he had to do to stop this, to make it end. But then, as he looked up at the figures, something changed. The darkness began to fade, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on him lifted. The figures dissolved into mist, vanishing one by one, leaving Evan alone in the silent, cold room. And then the whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. But it wasn't the same oppressive silence he had felt before. It was different, calm, almost peaceful. Evan stood up slowly, his legs weak beneath him. He looked around, but the room had changed. The walls were no longer alive. The darkness had faded, and now there was light. A single door stood in front of him. It wasn't like the others. This one was solid, simple, and it was open. Evan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment he stepped through, the light grew brighter, and he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. Evan took a deep breath as he crossed the threshold of the open door. The light on the other side was blinding, but unlike the oppressive darkness of the corridor, it felt warm, almost like a soft embrace. For a moment, he thought he could see the world beyond, the space he had once known before all of this began. His heart raced with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Could it be real? Could he have finally escaped? But as the light enveloped him, the world seemed to shift. The bright glow seemed to stretch into infinity, swirling around him like a cloud of fog. It was like walking through a dream, where everything was both familiar and alien at the same time. Suddenly, the light dimmed, and the world snapped back into focus. Evan found himself standing in his office, the same one he had been in at the beginning of this nightmare. The same sterile walls, the same buzzing of fluorescent lights overhead. For a moment, he stood there in stunned silence, blinking rapidly as if waking from a bad dream. Was he really back? Had he somehow made it out? He looked around the room, his breath catching in his throat. The desk was the same, the clutter of papers and office supplies untouched. His chair, his coffee mug, even the potted plant in the corner, all of it was exactly as he had left it. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick with tension, heavy with a presence he couldn't name. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Evan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. He reached for the handle, but it was locked. A laugh echoed in the room. It wasn't his own. Evan froze, his blood running cold. The laugh was unmistakable, filled with mockery, and as it faded, he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind him. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "No, no, no." He turned around quickly, his breath caught in his chest. The room hadn't changed, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was unbearable. And then, standing by the desk, was another figure. Evan's breath hitched. It was him. It was himself. But it wasn't the version of him he had seen before. The bruised, broken version that had haunted him. This one looked calm, controlled, too calm. His own face, but twisted in a way that made Evan's skin crawl. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile of knowing, of superiority. "Welcome back," the figure said, his voice soft and dangerous. "Did you think you could leave?" Evan's legs buckled, and he collapsed into the chair behind him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. This was just another trick, another part of the maze that had no end. He had faced himself before. He had seen the worst parts of himself, had acknowledged his mistakes. But this wasn't like the other versions. "You think you've beaten it, haven't you?" The figure walked toward him slowly, almost leisurely, its movements calculated and deliberate. "You thought running, hiding would save you. But the truth is, it was never about the hallways, the doors, or the reflections. It was always about you, the real you." Evan's eyes widened, his heart pounding harder with every word. "No, you're not me," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "You're not real." "Oh, but I am," the figure replied, his smile widening. "Everything you've seen, everything you've felt, it's all been you. All the fear, all the shame, all the things you refused to face. That's me. That's always been me." Evan scrambled to his feet, backing away, but the figure remained rooted in place. Its eyes locked onto his, and Evan could feel the weight of them, like they were digging into him, peeling away every layer of defense he had. "You're just a reflection," Evan whispered, as if trying to convince himself. "A part of me. A trick." The figure's laugh echoed again, sharp and hollow. "Trick? No. I'm the truth. You've been running from me your entire life. Hiding in these corridors, trying to escape the truth, trying to escape yourself." Evan shook his head, his breath quickening. "I faced it. I faced it all. I accepted everything. You think that makes it go away?" The figure sneered. "You think accepting the truth is enough? No. Facing it doesn't make it disappear. You can't hide from what's inside you. It will always be there, clawing, waiting for you to fall again." The figure stepped closer, its eyes never leaving Evan's. Every inch the figure moved toward him felt like a knife twisting deeper into Evan's chest. He could feel the weight of its words, each one seeping into his mind like poison. Evan could feel the panic rising in his throat, his mind spinning. He needed to escape. He needed to get out, to find the way back. But as he turned to look around the room, the walls seemed to shift again. The familiar office space was fading, twisting into something unrecognizable. The desk began to grow, towering over him like a mountain. The floor buckled beneath his feet. and the shadows around him seemed to stretch like fingers reaching for him. "You can't escape. Not from me. Not from yourself," the figure whispered, its voice now low, almost a hiss. Evan closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the figure's voice, the growing fear, the overwhelming sense of doom. But as he did, the world around him began to distort again. The sounds of his office faded, replaced by the far-off echoes of other things, other people, other versions of himself. The hallway, the doors, the whispers, they were all coming back. Evan opened his eyes, his pulse racing, only to find that he was no longer in the office at all. He was standing in the corridor again, the endless hallway stretching before him. The walls were alive once more, pulsating, shifting, growing. And the laughter, the mocking laughter, was louder than ever. Evan's heart pounded as he stood in the hallway, the walls pulsing around him like a living thing. His breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale hanging in the air, mingling with the thick silence. The laughter faded, but the weight of it lingered, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The hall stretched endlessly before him, the dark, uninviting doors standing in rows on either side, each one closed and silent. He had been down this path before, but now it felt different, darker, heavier, as though the very air was thick with something oppressive, something ancient. He turned around, expecting to see the twisted version of himself still standing there, but the corridor was empty. For a moment, the silence was almost peaceful, but it didn't last long. The walls seemed to hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound that reverberated through his chest. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, to find a way out, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The endless hall was no longer just a hallway. It had become something more, something alive. And as he stepped forward, the floor beneath him seemed to shift, undulating as though it were breathing too. He stumbled, barely catching himself against the wall. And then, just as he thought he could take a step forward, he saw it, a door at the end of the hall. It was unlike any other door he had seen. This one wasn't dark and closed off. It wasn't covered in dust and neglect. It stood out in the middle of the hall, glowing faintly, as if inviting him. For a moment, he considered turning back, but there was no choice. The hallway stretched endlessly in every direction, and the door at the end felt like the only way forward. He couldn't stand the weight of the silence, the heavy feeling pressing down on him from all sides. With a shaky breath, he forced himself to walk toward it, each step echoing down the hall. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to grow thick and dense, suffocating him. His heart thudded in his chest, his hands clammy with sweat. As he reached the door, he hesitated. He could feel something beyond it, something watching him. The sense of being observed had returned, more intense than ever. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the doorknob. It was cold, ice cold, but he turned it anyway. The door creaked open, and he stepped through. The room beyond was nothing like the others he had seen. It was vast, too vast, stretching on beyond what his eyes could comprehend. The walls seemed to bend and stretch, like a warped reflection of reality. The air was thick with dust, and the faint, musty smell of decay lingered. Evan took a step inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed in the space, and the floor beneath his feet shifted, groaning as though the room itself were waking up. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no way out. There were no windows, no doors, just an endless, distorted space that seemed to stretch into infinity. The only light came from flickering, dying bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to reach for him. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling in the emptiness. No answer. He stepped further into the room, his every movement slow, deliberate. He didn't know what to expect, what to find, but he couldn't stand the thought of staying still. There was something in this room, something waiting, and he needed to face it. As he moved deeper into the space, he heard a soft sound, like a whisper. At first, it was so faint he thought he might have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, and he realized it was coming from the far corner of the room. Evan hesitated, his heart thudding in his chest. He knew he had to go toward it. He couldn't avoid it anymore. There was no turning back. He walked cautiously toward the corner, his steps echoing through the space. And as he drew closer, the whisper grew louder, more distinct, until he could hear the words clearly. "Help me!" Evan stopped dead in his tracks. His blood ran cold. The voice, it was his. It was his own voice, but distorted, twisted, like it had been ripped from his throat in agony. He wanted to turn and run, to escape, but something in him, something deep within, compelled him to move closer. He reached the corner of the room, his legs unsteady beneath him. And then he saw it, a figure. It was him. But this version of Evan was different, horribly so. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, matted against his forehead with sweat. The figure was crouched in the corner, its arms wrapped around its knees as it rocked back and forth. It was him, but it wasn't. It was a broken version of himself, a version that had given up, a version that had been trapped in this place longer than he could imagine. Evan took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. Who are you?" The figure's head snapped up, and for a moment their eyes locked. And then it smiled, a smile full of malice and despair, stretching too wide, like it was trying to consume itself. "I'm you," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "I'm what you've always feared. The part of you tried to bury." Evan recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. "No, you're not real. You can't be." But the figure's smile only grew. "I've always been here, waiting, hiding in the cracks of your mind, waiting for you to see me." Evan backed away slowly, his pulse racing. The room was closing in around him again, the walls shifting, warping, like they were alive. The figure remained in the corner, watching him with those empty eyes, its grin never faltering. "You can't escape me, Evan," the figure said, its voice echoing in the room. "You can't escape yourself." Evan stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had to get out. He had to find a way. But as he turned toward what he thought was the door, he realized there was no way out. The room had changed. There was no longer any exit. The walls were closing in on him, the light flickering erratically above his head. And then, in the distance, he heard a sound. It was a soft sound at first, but it grew louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was coming. Evan's heart raced as the footsteps drew closer, each one louder than the last. His body froze, caught between the desperate need to escape and the overwhelming sense of dread that kept him rooted to the spot. The air in the room grew heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him. The figure in the corner, the broken reflection of himself, continued to rock back and forth, its smile widening as it whispered things Evan couldn't quite make out. The words were distorted, like a record playing too fast, too broken. "Help me! Please help me!" But Evan couldn't look away. The footsteps were growing nearer, the sound echoing in the empty space. Each step seemed to reverberate through his bones, sending cold shivers down his spine. His eyes darted to the far side of the room, and then he saw it. A door that hadn't been there a moment ago. It stood at the far end of the room, faint light spilling from the crack beneath it, beckoning him. But something told him that the door was not the answer. It was a trap, a promise of escape, but one he had learned never to trust. But the footsteps were almost upon him now. He couldn't ignore them. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to move. Evan took a shaky breath, gathering all his strength. He couldn't explain why, but he knew deep down that if he didn't make a choice now, it might be too late. With a sudden burst of energy, he turned and ran toward the door. The footsteps, once distant, were now right behind him, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the floor growing louder with each passing second. Evan's legs burned as he pushed himself harder, faster, his mind screaming for him to reach the door. He was almost there, just a few more steps. But as his fingers grazed the cold doorknob, he felt something brush against the back of his neck, something cold, like a breath, but not his own. His spine tingled with the sensation, a chill creeping down his back. The door swung open before he could touch the handle. It opened on its own, as if inviting him in, urging him forward. Evan hesitated for only a second before he stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike anything he had seen before. The air was thick and suffocating, like the walls themselves were alive, breathing, shifting. The floor was covered in a strange, sticky substance that clung to his shoes, pulling at his feet with every step. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were covered in strange symbols, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and squirm as if they were moving on their own. The ceiling above him was low, and the room seemed to shrink with every second that passed. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was him. No, it wasn't. The man before him was an older version of himself, his face lined with deep, dark wrinkles, his eyes hollow, devoid of life. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. But what struck Evan the most was the look in the man's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror. Hopelessness, defeat, the reflection of everything he had feared becoming true. The figure's mouth curled into a twisted smile, one that held no warmth, no kindness. It was a smile of knowing. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice raspy, dry. "You've come far, haven't you?" Evan's throat tightened, and he stepped back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, almost playfully. "I am you, the version of you that never left. The version that stayed behind, trapped in the maze of your own making." "No," Evan whispered, shaking his head. "You're not real." The figure laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. "Real? What does that even mean? You've seen it, haven't you? This place, this maze, none of it is real. But neither are you. Not anymore." Evan backed away further, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to leave before this twisted version of himself dragged him further into this hellish place. But the figure stepped toward him, its movement slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. "You think you can run, but it's too late for that. There's no way out, Evan. There's only one way forward." Evan's breath quickened. His legs felt weak, his body heavy with dread. He tried to step back, but the figure's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with inhuman strength. "No," Evan gasped, struggling to break free. "Let me go." But the figure's grip tightened, and its eyes darkened, more empty than ever. "You've always been running, Evan. Running from the truth. Running from yourself. But there is no escape anymore. You can't hide from who you are. You can't hide from me." Evan's chest tightened with fear, his mind spinning, his heart pounding. He knew this was it. He had to face it. Face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The words came unbidden, from somewhere deep inside him. "I am not you," Evan said, his voice shaky but strong. "I am not you." The figure's grip loosened, just for a moment. It stepped back, eyes narrowing, watching him with a twisted curiosity. Evan took the chance. He wrenched his wrist free and ran toward the far side of the room, where a narrow hallway led into darkness. He didn't know where it went, but it had to be better than staying here, facing his reflection. The figure's laughter echoed behind him, mocking, hollow. "You can't run forever," it called, its voice trailing off as Evan plunged into the darkness. Evan's footsteps echoed in the darkness, the sound of his own breath harsh and uneven in the silence. The narrow hallway stretched endlessly before him, the walls closing in with each step he took. The air was cold, biting, and it felt as though the very space around him was shrinking, forcing him to keep moving, to keep running. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. The laughter of the twisted version of himself still lingered in his ears, the sound scraping at his mind. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, drawing him back toward the figure, toward the truth he wasn't ready to face. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let it catch him. He had to keep running. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the same dull, flickering lights overhead casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. Each door he passed looked the same, gray, lifeless, closed, offering no answers, no escape. But then, as he rounded another corner, he saw something different. A door. It was just like all the others, but there was something about it. Something about the way the light played around its edges. That felt wrong. It didn't belong here. It was out of place, like it had been waiting for him to open it. He hesitated. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to ignore it, but his feet moved on their own, drawn toward the door like a moth to a flame. There was a strange sense of inevitability in the air, like everything had led him to this point. He reached out and touched the doorknob. It was warm like a heartbeat. Evan's hand trembled, and for a moment he almost pulled away. But then a voice whispered from behind him, soft and insistent. "Open it, Evan." His heart stuttered in his chest. That voice, it was his. He twisted the knob and stepped inside. The room beyond was small, confined, its walls lined with mirrors. Tall, thin mirrors that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. And at the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was the figure. His reflection. But something was wrong. This version of himself was different, horribly different. His eyes were wide, too wide, filled with a terror that Evan recognized all too well. His skin was pale, his lips cracked and dry, and his hands trembled as though he had just witnessed something unspeakable. "Evan," the reflection whispered, its voice just a shade too soft. "You've come back?" Evan's breath caught in his throat. The mirror version of himself slowly raised its hand, pointing toward him. "You can't escape it," it said, the words echoing in the empty room. "You never will. You've always known the truth. Always known that you're trapped." "No," Evan muttered, stepping back. "No, I'm not. I'm not trapped." The reflection smiled, but the smile didn't reach its eyes. It was twisted, cruel. "You are Evan. You're trapped in here, in this place, just like the rest of us. We've all been waiting for you to come to terms with what you've done." Evan's throat went dry. He had to get out. He had to leave this place before it consumed him entirely. But the mirrors, they weren't just reflections anymore. They were windows into something else, something far darker. As he stared into them, he could see other versions of himself, different twisted versions, each one staring back at him, their eyes filled with desperation and pain. They reached toward him, their fingers pressing against the glass, as if begging for release. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. "No, I didn't do anything." The reflection's grin grew wider, its eyes flashing with malice. "You didn't mean to, did you? But you've always been here, Evan. You've always been part of this. You've always been trapped in this place. And so will we all be." Suddenly, the mirrors began to ripple, distorting the figures within. The faces twisted, stretched, warped into grotesque shapes, as if they were being pulled apart from the inside out. The air grew thick with an unnatural pressure, and Evan could feel his pulse racing, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He had to leave. He turned, his legs unsteady beneath him, and ran. He ran back into the hallway, his footsteps clattering against the floor. The hallway stretched out before him, endless, unforgiving. But the laughter followed him. It echoed off the walls, a maddening, unrelenting sound that made his skin crawl. The more he ran, the louder it grew, until it felt like it was all around him, closing in on him from every direction. "Stop running, Evan," the voice of the figure called from behind. "You can't run forever. You'll never escape." Evan's chest heaved as he pushed himself faster, his body protesting, his mind screaming. He had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. And then, as he rounded yet another corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A door. But this one was different. It was open. It beckoned him. It was the only door in sight. He approached it slowly, cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to turn away. But there was no other choice. There was no escape, no way forward. He had to face whatever was behind that door. With shaking hands, he stepped through. The room beyond was dark, pitch black, but something was there, something moving. He could feel it, something watching him. And then the light flickered. For a split second, he saw them. Hundreds of mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of himself. Some were twisted, distorted, others seemed normal, but all of them were staring at him, their eyes full of the same fear, the same hopelessness. And in the center of them stood a figure that wasn't him. Not entirely, but it could have been. It was his face, his eyes, his body, but something else, something darker, lingered there. The figure smiled, and Evan felt the weight of its gaze pressing on him. "Welcome home, Evan," the figure whispered. The room began to pulse. The mirrors began to warp and twist, the reflections multiplying, reaching out to him. He couldn't escape. And then in that moment, he understood. He had always been here. The room spun around him. The mirrors warped, reflecting not only his image but dozens of others, distorted, broken, twisted into grotesque versions of himself. Each one seemed to whisper, calling his name, pulling him deeper into the suffocating space. Evan stumbled backward, his pulse quickening, his mind reeling. The figure before him, his reflection, or was it? Smiled again, that same twisted, knowing smile, and took a step closer. "You've come full circle, Evan," it said softly, its voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to crawl under his skin. "You can't escape who you are. This place, this maze, it's you. It's always been you." "No," Evan choked, his throat dry as he fought to breathe. This can't be real." The figure's smile widened, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "Real? What is real, Evan? What is the truth? You've been running from yourself, hiding in every corner of your mind, afraid to face what you've become. But you're here now, aren't you?" Evan's mind raced, his vision blurred as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Every door, every hallway, every room, it was all a part of him. It was all built from his own thoughts, his own fears. The walls closed in, the mirrors reflecting every part of his psyche, every hidden corner of his mind that he had tried so hard to forget. "No," he whispered again, but this time the words felt empty. I didn't want this. You never wanted it, but you've always been here," the figure continued, taking another step forward. "You've always been trapped, unable to escape the darkness inside you." Evan shook his head, trying to back away, but the room seemed to shrink with each movement. The walls were closing in, the mirrors shifting and distorting as the reflections of his other selves pressed closer. They whispered his name, their voices overlapping, rising in a cacophony of maddening sound. "Please," he gasped, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "Please stop." The figure tilted its head, observing him with cold, unfeeling eyes. "Stop? Why would I stop? This is what you wanted. You wanted to know the truth, didn't you? You wanted to know what was behind the door, what lay hidden in the dark corners of your mind." "No!" Evan cried out, his hands trembling as he reached for the nearest mirror, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." The reflection in the mirror shifted, the face staring back at him morphing into something else, something darker, more sinister. It grinned at him, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Its eyes burned with a familiar emptiness, like a hollow shell. "You did," the figure said. "You've always wanted it. You wanted to know how far you could push yourself, how far you could go before you broke. And now you're here. You've broken." Evan's knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the cold floor, his hands gripping the edges of the mirror as if they were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The reflections of himself surrounded him, each one whispering, calling, pulling him deeper into the abyss of his own mind. The walls seemed to pulse, the room closing in tighter, suffocating him. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of his own guilt, his own failures pressing down on him. The voices, the whispers, the reflections, they were all him. They were all the parts of himself he had tried to ignore, tried to bury deep inside. He closed his eyes, his hands shaking as he covered his ears, but it didn't stop the voices. They only grew louder. "You can't escape," they chanted. "You can't run from yourself." And then, in the silence between the whispers, he heard a voice that was not his own. "Evan." He opened his eyes, blinking through the darkness. The figure, the one standing in front of him, spoke again, its voice soft, soothing. "You've been running for so long. You've been so afraid of facing the truth. But you've already faced it. You've always known it. It's time to accept it." "No," Evan gasped, shaking his head. "No, I'm not. I'm not like this. I don't belong here." The figure's smile softened, but there was no warmth in it. "You do. You always have. You're part of this place, part of the maze, and you can't escape it. You can't escape yourself." Evan's chest tightened, his heart pounding in his ears as the words sank in. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, a crushing weight he couldn't ignore. The truth, the horrible, painful truth, was that he had always been here. This maze, this endless corridor, had never been about finding a way out. It had been about confronting the darkest parts of himself, the parts he had tried so hard to hide, to forget. But there was no hiding anymore. He was trapped within his own mind, within his own fears, and there was no escaping the endless corridor. No way out. "No," Evan whispered again, his voice trembling. "I won't give up. I won't let this, whatever this is, take me." The figure's expression remained unchanged, its eyes cold and distant. "It's not about giving up, Evan. It's about accepting, embracing the truth. You're not going anywhere. This is your home now. This is where you belong." The room seemed to pulse with the figure's words, and Evan felt the walls close in tighter, the mirrors pressing closer, the reflections of himself whispering louder. He could feel himself being pulled in, drawn deeper into the darkness, until there was nothing left. Nothing but him. The room was suffocating now. Every breath Evan took felt heavier, as though the very air itself was thickening, pressing down on him. The reflections in the mirrors seemed to multiply, the endless faces of himself staring back at him with expressions that ranged from fear to anger to sorrow. It was as if they were all watching him, waiting for him to finally break. Evan stood there, his legs trembling beneath him, his mind a swirl of confusion and panic. He couldn't tell what was real anymore, what was true. Every corner of the room felt like it was closing in on him, the mirrors reflecting more versions of himself, each one more distorted and warped than the last. They were all the same, yet different, all looking at him with judgment, with accusation. "You've always been here," the figure whispered, its voice a soft hiss that seemed to come from everywhere. "You've always been a part of this. You've always known this was your fate." "No," Evan croaked, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the panic rising in his throat. "No, this isn't me. This isn't who I am." The figure before him only smiled, its face twisting with a dark, knowing satisfaction. "You can deny it all you want, Evan, but this is who you are. This is what you've become." Evan's chest tightened, the weight of the figure's words crashing down on him. He had tried to run. He had tried to escape, to find a way out of this nightmare. But now there was nowhere left to go. No doors, no hallways. The maze had closed in around him, and he was trapped within the very walls of his own mind. He closed his eyes, unable to look at the reflections anymore, the twisted versions of himself that seemed to mock him, to judge him. The air was thick with their whispers, each one cutting deeper into his consciousness, pulling him under. "You're nothing but a shadow of your former self," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You've been running from your own reflection for so long. But it's time to face it." "No!" Evan shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm not like this. I'm not like them." The figure's grin widened, showing sharp, yellowed teeth. You've always been like this, Evan. You just didn't want to see it. But now, you have no choice. You're trapped in your own mind, and the only way out is through. Evan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words caught in his throat. His body felt numb, as if it wasn't his own. The figure's presence was suffocating, its gaze heavy and unyielding. He had to do something. He had to get out of here. But how? How could he escape when there was no way out? No doors, no windows. Just mirrors. Endless mirrors reflecting his worst fears, his darkest thoughts. Look at yourself, Evan, the figure urged, its voice soft but insistent. Look at what you've become. Evan turned, his eyes drawn unwillingly to the nearest mirror. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see. But his body betrayed him, and his gaze locked onto his reflection. The man staring back at him was not the man he knew. His face was gaunt, hollow, eyes wide and sunken, filled with a fear that felt all too familiar. The man in the mirror was crying, his hands pressed against the glass, begging for release. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Evan staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, I'm not like that. I'm not him." But the reflection did not change. It only grew more distorted, its features twisting and warping until the face in the mirror was unrecognizable, a monster of his own making. The figure behind him spoke again, its voice laced with cruel amusement. "This is you, Evan. This is who you've always been. A broken man, trapped by his own fears." "No," Evan screamed, slamming his fist into the mirror. The glass shattered, sending a spray of cold shards into the air, but the reflection didn't disappear. It lingered, hovering in the shattered fragments, the pieces of his shattered self staring back at him. The world around him seemed to collapse, the walls shifting and warping as though the entire room was crumbling into nothingness. The reflections of himself multiplied, each one a distorted, nightmarish version of the man he had once been. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind, each one an accusation, a condemnation. "You can't escape," they chanted. "You can't hide from yourself." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. "You think you can break free from this, from what you've become? You can't. It's too late for you, Evan. You're already lost." Evan's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He felt his legs buckle beneath him, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His head spun as the room continued to shift and warp, the mirrors multiplying, each one showing him a version of himself he could no longer recognize. But through the chaos, through the overwhelming fear and despair, a single thought pierced through the fog of his mind. He had to fight back. He couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free from this endless nightmare. With a sudden burst of energy, Evan reached out, his fingers trembling as they touched the shards of the shattered mirror. He grabbed hold of one of the jagged pieces, the glass cold and sharp against his skin. "Enough," he whispered through clenched teeth. "I won't let you win." The figure's grin faltered for a moment, its eyes narrowing. "What do you think you can do with that, Evan? You can't stop it. You can't stop what's coming." But Evan wasn't listening. He lifted the shard, his hands shaking but steady with resolve, and slashed it through the air, slicing through the fabric of the twisted room. The mirrors shattered. The walls cracked. The room began to collapse in on itself, the reflections of his other selves scattering into nothingness. And for a brief moment, everything stopped. The room was silent. The mirrors were gone. The reflections had vanished. Evan stood alone, his breath ragged, his body covered in cold sweat. But the silence, it was different. It felt like a breath of fresh air, a small, fragile sliver of peace. But how long would it last? The silence hung heavy in the air, but Evan didn't trust it. He couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. Every time he thought he'd escaped, something darker had always followed. The maze wasn't over. It never was. He took a deep breath, his hands still clutching the shard of broken glass. The room around him was still. The mirrors, the reflections, they were gone. The walls felt solid again, no longer shifting like they were alive, no longer closing in on him. It almost felt like the room was waiting for something. Evan scanned the space. The hallway beyond the door was dark, almost suffocatingly so. There was no light to guide him, no sign of the endless corridors he had wandered through earlier. It was just a blank, oppressive darkness. But it didn't feel like freedom. He forced himself to step forward, his feet heavy, his pulse still racing. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to find another way. But there was no turning back. He couldn't run anymore. The door behind him slammed shut. Evan spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. He hadn't heard it close, hadn't seen it move, but now it was sealed shut, the wood cold and unyielding. The only way forward was the dark hallway. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" But there was no answer, only the faintest echo of his voice bouncing off the walls. It felt unnatural, like the hallway itself was swallowing his words. He hesitated. What was waiting for him down there? Another reflection of himself? Another twisted version of the man he'd become? He gripped the shard tighter, the jagged edges cutting into his palm. The blood was warm, but it didn't matter. He didn't care. The fear was worse than the pain. Slowly, he took another step forward, the darkness swallowing him whole. With each step, the air grew colder, the silence deeper. It was as if the hallway stretched on forever, endless in its emptiness. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowering, but the door he had passed through remained locked behind him, keeping him trapped in this suffocating space. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A figure. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was there, just at the edge of his vision, standing in the shadows, unmoving. "Who's there?" Evan called out, his voice cracking. No answer. He took another step forward, his every muscle tense, every fiber of his being screaming to turn around, to run. But he couldn't. There was nowhere to run to. The figure shifted, a dark shape moving in the shadows. It was just a silhouette, a vague, shapeless form, but Evan could feel its presence. It was watching him. Suddenly, it stepped into the light, and Evan's stomach dropped. It was him. No, not exactly. It was a version of him, but not the one he knew. This man had hollow, empty eyes, his face gaunt and sunken, his mouth stretched in a grotesque smile. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, like it was made of something other than flesh. Evan recoiled, taking a step back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes locked onto Evan's with a knowing, unblinking stare. "Who are you?" Evan whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, its features slowly starting to shift and distort. The skin on its face seemed to peel away, revealing something darker, something unnatural beneath. Its smile twisted into a sneer, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Stop," Evan pleaded, stepping back again. "Please stop." But it didn't stop. It only moved closer, its feet gliding across the floor, not even touching the ground. Evan's heart raced, his chest tightening with fear. He didn't know what this thing was, but he knew one thing: it wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was just another twisted reflection of himself, a piece of his mind that he couldn't escape. "Leave me alone," Evan gasped, his voice rising in panic. But the figure didn't respond. It simply reached out, its hand stretching toward Evan with slow, deliberate movements. The fingers elongated unnaturally, growing longer, sharp claws at the ends. Evan's mind was spinning. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening again. He had broken the mirrors, shattered everything that had tried to trap him in that maze. Yet here it was, this thing, this version of himself, crawling out from the darkness, determined to drag him back into whatever nightmare he had created. The claws reached closer, just inches from his face, and Evan could feel the cold, sickening presence of it, the sense that something was about to rip him apart from the inside. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't move. Suddenly, with a burst of adrenaline, Evan shoved himself forward, the shard of glass in his hand piercing the air. He thrust it toward the figure, aiming for its chest. But the figure stopped it with ease. The glass shard froze in midair, inches from its body. The figure's hand reached out, grabbing the shard with unnatural speed and strength, its grip tightening around the glass. Evan gasped as the figure's smile widened, showing more teeth. "You still don't get it, do you?" the figure said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "There's no escaping. There's nowhere to hide." With a terrifying twist, the figure yanked the shard out of Evan's hand, the glass scraping against his skin. He cried out in pain, but it was drowned out by the figure's chilling laughter. Evan stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in front of him, the darkness closing in with every step he took. He was running, but where to? Evan's legs burned as he ran, his feet pounding against the cold, hard floor. The darkness behind him was closing in, suffocating, relentless. Every shadow seemed to reach out for him, clawing at his heels as if the very hallway itself was alive, hungry for his fear. He dared not look back. He couldn't. If he did, he was sure he would see that twisted version of himself right behind him, its fingers outstretched, its monstrous smile widening. There had to be a way out. He had to find it. But the hallway stretched on, endless, its walls shifting and warping with every step. It felt like the whole building was alive, like it was watching him, waiting for him to break. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving with every gasping breath. Sweat poured down his face, his body drenched in the cold, sticky feeling of dread. The walls seemed to close in around him, narrowing with every step, and the hallway felt smaller, more claustrophobic. He couldn't keep running like this. Not forever. Suddenly, something flickered in the distance, a faint light, barely visible through the thick darkness. It was small, but it was there, a distant beacon of hope in the sea of black. Without thinking, Evan pushed himself harder, his legs moving faster, desperate to reach the light. It was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing that might lead him out of this nightmare. But the light never seemed to get closer. With every step, the distance between him and the light seemed to grow. It was as if the hallway was stretching further, pulling him away from his goal, taunting him with the illusion of escape. "No, no!" Evan shouted, his voice hoarse, his mind spinning with the horror of it all. "I have to get out. I can't stay here." The light flickered again, more urgently this time, and Evan redoubled his efforts. He pushed forward with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind numbed by panic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached it. The light was coming from a small, wooden door at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't much, just an ordinary door, no different from the ones he had passed before. But the light spilling from underneath it felt like salvation. It was warm, welcoming, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness that surrounded him. Evan's hand reached for the doorknob, trembling with fear and anticipation. He didn't know what was on the other side. He didn't care. All he wanted was to get away from this place, to escape the nightmare that had been chasing him for what felt like forever. But as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a voice broke through the silence. "Evan!" The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it froze him in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat, and his body went rigid. He knew that voice. He turned slowly, his body reluctant, his eyes unwilling to face what he knew was behind him. But he couldn't help it. His body betrayed him. Standing at the end of the hallway was the figure. The same twisted, distorted version of himself, its mouth twisted into that cruel, knowing grin. Its eyes were wide, empty, and hollow, staring at him with a sickening intensity. "No," Evan whispered, his voice cracking. "No, not again." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its grin widening, its presence suffocating. "You can't escape. it said, its voice low and guttural, a twisted mockery of his own. "You're already here. You've always been here." Evan's mind reeled, the words cutting through him like a knife. He felt the cold sweat pooling on his skin, the panic rising again in his chest. It was like his mind was being crushed under the weight of the figure's words. "No!" Evan shouted, shaking his head, trying to push away the suffocating fear. "I'm not you. I'm not a part of this." But the figure only laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "You've always been a part of this, Evan. Don't you see? This is you. This is your mind. This is your nightmare." "No," Evan said again, his voice shaking. "No, this isn't me." The figure stepped forward, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive with each movement. "You can't hide from yourself. You can't run forever. You'll never escape." Evan's pulse raced, the figure's words echoing in his mind, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to fight back, wanted to scream, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His legs were shaking, his mind was spinning, and the fear was all-encompassing. Suddenly, the figure lunged at him, its hand outstretched, claws gleaming in the faint light. It was too fast, too strong. Evan didn't have time to react. The figure grabbed him, its grip like iron, pulling him back down the hallway, dragging him away from the door. "No!" Evan screamed, his body fighting against the figure's hold, but it was useless. The figure was too strong. He was being dragged back into the darkness, pulled away from the light. The hallway stretched on, an endless nightmare that seemed to have no end. And the figure was still there, smiling, its eyes filled with dark amusement. "You can't escape," it whispered again, its voice echoing in Evan's ears. "You're mine. You always have been. The door, the light, it was gone now, swallowed by the darkness, just like everything else." And Evan realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that he had never truly escaped. The endless corridor had been with him all along, pulling him deeper into his own mind, into his own fears. It wasn't the building that was trapping him. It was himself, and there was no way out. The darkness swallowed Evan whole as he was dragged further into the hallway, the relentless grip of the figure tightening around his arm. His thoughts scrambled, his mind unraveling with every step. The walls seemed to bend and twist, warping around him like they were alive, squeezing him tighter with each passing moment. It was as if the very air in the corridor was suffocating him, pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He tried to scream again, but the words stuck in his throat. No sound came out, just a desperate, strangled breath. His legs kicked uselessly, his feet dragging across the cold floor as the figure continued to pull him forward. The figure was laughing now, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the hall, making Evan's skin crawl. "You still don't get it," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "You'll never get out. You're mine now." Evan's heart raced as he struggled to break free, his mind screaming in panic. He couldn't let this thing take him. He couldn't let it win. But every attempt to break free was met with resistance. The figure's grip was unyielding, its strength beyond anything Evan could comprehend. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how much he tried to push away, it was like trying to escape from his own shadow. As they moved deeper into the corridor, Evan's surroundings began to change. The walls, once cold and sterile, now seemed to pulse with life. The floor beneath him grew uneven, as if it was shifting and changing beneath his feet. The faint sound of whispers filled the air, voices he couldn't make out, but they were everywhere, surrounding him, closing in on him. He felt like he was losing his mind. "You've been running from yourself," the figure taunted, its voice right next to his ear. "But you can't outrun your own mind, Evan. You can't escape what's already inside of you." The figure's words drilled into Evan's skull, gnawing at him, feeding the dread that was already bubbling inside him. The thoughts, the whispers, they were all becoming one, merging into the very fabric of the nightmare he was trapped in. His own fears, his regrets, his guilt, they were alive in this place. They were all real now, taking shape, surrounding him like a suffocating fog. Evan's head spun. He could barely keep track of time anymore, or space. The hallway stretched on, never ending, like a loop he couldn't break free from. And the figure, that twisted version of himself, was always there, just out of reach, its grin never fading, its eyes cold and knowing. "You can't run from the truth," it whispered. "You can't run from yourself. You'll always be here." Evan's legs gave way beneath him, his body too weak to continue fighting. He collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving, gasping for air. The weight of everything, the darkness, the figure, the never-ending hallway, it was too much. It was all too much. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't know why. Was it because of the hopelessness that consumed him? Or was it the realization that this was all his doing? That he had somehow trapped himself in this nightmare, created this endless corridor of fear and regret? He had been running his entire life, running from the things he had done, the choices he had made. He had thought he could escape, thought he could outrun the consequences. But now, in this place, he saw it clearly. There was no escaping himself. The figure crouched down beside him, its breath cold against his skin. "It's all your fault," it hissed. "You made this. You created this place." Evan's heart hammered in his chest. He shook his head, trying to push the figure away, but it was no use. The figure was him, and he was it. They were one and the same. "No, no," Evan cried out, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to." The figure's grin widened, its sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. "It doesn't matter now. You can't change what's been done. You've created your own prison, and now you're stuck here forever." The floor beneath him seemed to ripple, as if it were alive. The shadows around him deepened, twisting and writhing like a living thing, closing in on him from all sides. The walls seemed to press him tighter, suffocating him, pushing him further into the grip of his own terror. He was trapped. "Please let me go," Evan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please." The figure laughed again, its voice cold and hollow. "You don't get it, do you? There's no going back. You can't leave this place. You've become part of it. This hallway, this nightmare, it's all you now." Evan's mind reeled. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was like the very air was being stolen from him, and with every passing moment, he felt more and more suffocated. The hallway, the figure, the voices, they were all merging into one. There was no escape. There never had been. And then, just as he thought he would suffocate under the weight of it all, a faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance. It was small, like a star in the dark, but it was there. And this time, it didn't feel like a cruel trick. It felt like hope, but as quickly as it appeared, it began to fade, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Evan's eyes widened, and he reached out for it, his hand trembling. "No," he gasped. "Please." But it was gone. The darkness returned, and the figure stood over him, its grin widening as it watched him struggle. "Hope," the figure sneered. "There's no hope here, Evan. You've already seen the truth. This is where you belong." Evan's hand fell to the floor, the last remnants of his hope vanishing into the abyss. The figure's words echoed in his mind, and the darkness closed in, trapping him in his own despair. And this time, Evan knew it was true. There was no way out. The world around Evan seemed to blur, his sense of reality flickering like a dying light. The figure, the twisted reflection of himself, loomed above him, its eyes empty, hollow, full of the darkness that had consumed him. Every breath he took was a struggle, the air thick and oppressive, filled with a suffocating weight he couldn't escape. The hallway was alive now, shifting with every step he took, warping and distorting as if the very building was feeding off his fear. The walls pulsed, the floors cracked and groaned, as if they were alive, listening to his every thought, his every breath. The whispers in the air grew louder, curling around his mind like 1,000 voices, all calling to him at once. But none of them mattered anymore. Not the voices, not the endless hallway, not the figure standing over him. Nothing mattered. "You still don't get it," the figure said, its voice low and mocking. You can't escape yourself. You're trapped here because of the choices you've made, because of who you are. Evan's eyes blurred with tears as the words sank in. He had always thought he could outrun his mistakes, that he could leave them behind in some dark corner of his past. But this was the truth. The choices, the regrets, the fear, he had never escaped any of it. It had followed him, all of it, until now, when it had consumed him completely. He had always been running. Always. From his past, from the things he had done, from the person he had become. And now, there was nowhere left to run. The figure bent down closer, its cold breath brushing against his skin. "This is your punishment," it whispered. "You wanted to forget, to escape. But there's no escaping this. Not anymore." Evan's mind reeled as he tried to push away the figure's words, tried to find some shred of hope, some way out. But the darkness around him was too strong. It pressed in on him from all sides like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest. No, I can't," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Please." But the figure just laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent a shiver down Evan's spine. "You still think you can get away? You can't. You're already lost." Evan felt the walls closing in. The hallway stretched on, a never-ending maze of darkness and despair. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body felt numb, like it was no longer his own. His mind was fogged with fear and confusion, his thoughts swirling in an endless loop of helplessness. He stumbled forward, his feet dragging as he moved deeper into the hallway. The figure was always there, following him, watching him with its cold, unblinking eyes. "Where are you going?" the figure taunted, its voice growing louder, echoing in Evan's ears. "There's nowhere to run." Evan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know where he was going, or if he could even move anymore. The darkness around him felt like a living thing, suffocating him, drowning him in its weight. But then, just when he thought he couldn't take any more, something changed. A flicker of light appeared again, small but bright, at the end of the corridor. This time it didn't fade. It was steady, unwavering. It was real, and it was different. It was a door. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. He had seen doors before, but they had all been illusions, traps designed to keep him running in circles. But this door, this one, felt different. It felt like it was real, like it was the way out. Without thinking, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him, his chest burning with every breath. The figure was still behind him, laughing, its voice growing louder, more mocking. "You can't escape," it said. "There's no way out." But Evan didn't listen. He couldn't listen anymore. The light at the end of the hallway was all that mattered now. The door. The escape. He ran. His legs felt like lead, but he pushed himself harder, faster. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how close he was, how much he needed to get out. He could feel the figure behind him, the presence of it, the weight of its gaze, but he didn't stop. Not this time. The door was closer now, just a few feet away. He could almost feel the warmth coming from it, a promise of something other than the endless darkness that had surrounded him for so long. But as his hand reached for the doorknob, the figure's voice stopped him cold. "You're too late." Evan froze, his hand hovering just inches from the knob. The figure's voice was like ice, cold and final. "You'll never leave," it said. "This is where you belong. This is your place. You've made your choices. You can't escape who you are." Evan's hand trembled as he gripped the doorknob, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. He wanted to turn back, wanted to give up, but something inside him refused to let go. He couldn't be trapped in this nightmare forever. He wouldn't be. With a final surge of strength, he twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. The light from beyond the door was blinding, too bright for his eyes to adjust at first. But as the door swung wide, a flood of light filled the hallway, cutting through the darkness. For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers, the mocking laughter, the heavy weight of the figure, they all faded into nothingness. Evan stepped forward, the light washing over him, pulling him in. And as the door closed behind him, the darkness disappeared. He was free. Evan's eyes adjusted to the light, his body trembling with exhaustion. The corridor, the figure, the endless nightmare, everything was gone. All that remained was the blinding light, now soft and warm, filling the space around him. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what was happening. The hallway, the twisted version of himself, the suffocating darkness. It all seemed so far away now, like a bad dream he had finally woken up from. His breath slowed as he took in his surroundings. It was a room. A simple, plain room, but there was something peaceful about it. The walls were light and neutral, bathed in the soft glow of natural light coming from a window that was framed with light curtains. A desk sat in the corner, papers neatly stacked, an empty coffee mug resting beside a computer screen. Everything was orderly, calm, normal. Evan took a step forward, unsure, his feet hesitant on the floor. Was this real? Was it over? He looked around, his eyes searching for any sign that the nightmare still clung to him. But nothing seemed out of place. Everything was so ordinary, too ordinary almost. He moved toward the window, drawn to it, hoping for some kind of clarity, some indication of what was happening. He pulled the curtains back, his heart in his throat, and looked out. It was a view of the city. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a warm golden glow over the skyline. The streets below were bustling with people, cars moving in their usual patterns, the world going on as if nothing had changed. The noise from the city seemed distant but real, like the hum of life that was so far removed from the dark corridor he had just escaped. Could it be? Could this truly be the end? Evan felt a strange sensation wash over him. A sense of calm, yes, but also a deep, gnawing unease. Something didn't feel right. His mind, still clouded by the remnants of his nightmare, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Suddenly, the door behind him creaked open, and Evan spun around, his heart racing again. A man stood in the doorway, dressed in a suit, his face impassive. He looked completely ordinary, his features neutral, his expression unreadable. But something about him made Evan's stomach twist with unease. The man was too calm, too collected. "Evan," the man said, his voice smooth and almost too polite, like he was reading from a script. "You've been in there long enough." Evan's breath hitched. What do you mean? Where am I?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're home," he replied simply. "You've completed the cycle. It's over." The words hit Evan like a punch to the gut. "Cycle? What cycle? What do you mean?" The man's expression didn't change. "You've been through it all. The hallway, the fear, the darkness. And now you're here. You're free." Evan's mind was spinning. He couldn't grasp what was happening. The hallway, had it all been a dream? Was this some kind of cruel joke? But the hallway, the doors, the other me, was that real? The man stepped into the room, moving slowly, deliberately. His gaze never left Evan, as though he were studying him. Oh, it was real as anything else. But the question is, what do you think it was? Evan stumbled backward, his heart pounding. I don't know. I thought I was trapped. I thought I couldn't escape." The man nodded, as if Evan had just answered an unspoken question. "You were trapped, but not by the building, not by the hallway. You were trapped by your own mind, by your own fears, your own regrets." Evan's stomach churned, the truth of it dawning on him. I created that place, didn't I? The hallway, the endless corridor, it was all me." The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Yes, it always has been. You couldn't escape from yourself, Evan. You tried to outrun your mistakes, your guilt, your fears. But no matter how far you ran, no matter how many doors you opened, they were always there, waiting for you." Evan felt his knees weaken, the weight of the realization crushing him. He had known it deep down. He had known that the horror, the never-ending corridor, the figure that mocked him with every step, it was all a reflection of himself. His own darkness, his own mind. He wanted to collapse, to curl into a ball and shut out everything. But the man's voice, calm and unyielding, held him in place. It's over now, Evan. You've faced your fears. You've walked through the dark corridors of your own mind. Now you can move forward. You're free. Evan didn't respond. His mind was reeling, but something inside him was stirring, a desire to break free, to find peace. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly freedom. Something still didn't feel right. The man took a step closer, and for a brief moment, Evan could see the glint of something in his eyes. Something dark, something sinister. You'll never truly be free, you know, the man said, his voice softening, but the words were like ice. You may think you've escaped, but your mind will always be with you. You can never outrun yourself. Evan's breath caught in his throat as the man's words echoed in his mind. They felt like a final warning, a chilling reminder of the never-ending cycle that awaited him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many doors he opened, he would always be trapped in the same place. In his own mind, the door behind him slammed shut, and Evan's gaze snapped to it. The sound was deafening, and he was left alone again, staring at the walls of this new room that seemed so familiar, yet so foreign. Was this the beginning of a new cycle? Or was this the end of it all? Only time would tell. Evan stood frozen in the middle of the room, his mind racing. The door had slammed shut behind him, locking him in once again. It wasn't a physical lock, though. It was a feeling, an inescapable, invisible barrier that closed him in, pressing him back into the familiar sense of dread. His eyes darted to the man who stood before him. He had vanished, disappeared into thin air, as if he had never existed. All that remained were the walls, the soft light, and the overwhelming sense of isolation. The stillness in the room seemed to pulse, vibrating under Evan's skin. It felt as though the air itself was alive, watching, waiting. He took a shaky step forward, hoping, praying that something, anything, would tell him that this was real, that he was truly free. But the room remained unchanged. Everything in it was pristine, sterile, too perfect. He had faced his demons. He had walked through the nightmare of endless hallways and the reflection of himself. So why did he still feel trapped? Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in a little tighter. The ceiling above him felt lower, the space shrinking by the second. Evan stepped back, panic setting in. His breath quickened, and the familiar feeling of suffocation returned, even though he wasn't sure where it came from. He reached for the window, his hand trembling as it hovered over the curtain, but the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, he pulled away sharply. The outside world, the view of the city, the soft sunset light, wasn't real. It had never been. It was a lie. The city outside warped in his vision, turning into an endless expanse of gray, stretching out infinitely. The streets dissolved into mist. The people below became mere shadows. Everything around him faded to emptiness, to nothingness, to the same oppressive blankness he had been trying to escape for so long. Evan gasped, stumbling back. No, no, no. He spun around in the room, his hands shaking, clutching at the edges of the desk, the walls. This isn't real. This isn't real. But his voice cracked in the air, swallowed by the heavy silence. He was still alone, still lost. The same nightmare, over and over again. The door was back. The door that had slammed shut earlier now stood open, as though it had never been locked. He couldn't trust it. He knew that much. It had never mattered before. It was always an illusion, a trick. But then, through the haze of his panic, Evan saw something else, a figure standing just beyond the doorway. The figure of himself. It was him, or something that looked like him, standing with a blank, empty expression on his face. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted grin, the reflection of himself from before. It was still following him. It had never left. You can't escape, the figure said, its voice cold and devoid of emotion. You will never escape. Evan felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. The reality of it, the crushing truth, was too much for him to bear. No matter where he ran, no matter how many doors he opened, it would always be there. The figure, the nightmare, his own mind, his own fears, always chasing him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The figure stepped into the room, its footsteps echoing unnervingly as it crossed the threshold. Every movement it made was slow, deliberate, and it came closer to him with each passing second. Every time you think you're free, the figure continued, its voice dripping with mockery. I'll be there waiting. You'll never outrun me. You'll never outrun yourself. Evan's chest tightened. The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The figure was getting closer, and the dread swelled inside him. He didn't know how much longer he could stand it. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the terror had paralyzed him. With shaking hands, he reached for the door handle. But it was too late. The figure was standing right behind him now, its breath cold on the back of his neck. You can't run, the figure whispered. You've never been able to. Evan's hand tightened on the doorknob, and he wrenched the door open, throwing himself into the hallway. The same hallway, the same endless corridor. No, not again. His heart pounded in his chest as he took in the familiar sight of the long, dimly lit hallway. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, each door a trap, each corner an endless loop leading back to where he had started. His reflection, that twisted, monstrous version of himself, followed him down the hall, its cold laugh echoing in his ears. He had been here before. He knew this place. He knew it all too well. The fear, the despair, the feeling that he would never find a way out. He had been running in circles, trapped in this nightmare for what felt like an eternity. And yet, he couldn't stop. Evan reached for a door, his hand shaking as it grasped the handle, and opened it. Another room. Another version of himself. He closed the door quickly and moved to the next, only to be greeted by yet another twisted reflection. Each room, each door, revealed a different version of himself, a version that mocked him, judged him, condemned him. Each door led to more of the same, more of his own darkness, more of his own fears. And no matter how many doors he opened, no matter how far he ran, there was no escape. He was back where he had started, stuck in the endless corridor, with no way out. The figure appeared in the distance again, slowly walking toward him. It didn't need to hurry. It knew Evan could never escape, and neither could he. Isn't it beautiful? The figure said, its voice almost tender, almost soothing. This place, it's your home now. Evan could only stare at the figure, his body numb, his mind reeling. He had tried to escape. He had tried to break free. But it was always the same. Always the endless cycle. Always running from himself, only to be trapped again. This was his prison. The figure was standing in front of him now, its hollow eyes locked onto Evan's. The hallway stretched infinitely in both directions behind them, the faint sound of the figure's voice still echoing in Evan's ears. You can keep running, it said softly, but you'll always end up here in this place. In your mind. Evan stepped back, his legs weak beneath him, but his body moved instinctively, driven by a mixture of fear and desperation. He didn't want to believe it. He refused to believe that this was his fate, to be trapped forever in an endless cycle of torment, haunted by his own mind. No, Evan whispered to himself. I can't. I won't. His voice faltered. It was becoming harder to find the will to resist. His body felt heavier with every passing moment, and his mind, it seemed like it was slowly starting to unravel. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost curiously. Why do you fight it? Why do you keep trying to escape when you know there's no point? You are the one who created this. You're the one who's trapped in this endless corridor. Evan's eyes burned with tears, but he refused to cry. He couldn't. Not again. Not when the only thing he had left to hold on to was the hope that he could get out. The thought of being trapped here, forever reliving this same cycle, was too much to bear. His hands were shaking as they grasped the next door handle, and he yanked the door open. But when he stepped through, he didn't find another room. He found himself in the same corridor, the same stretch of endless hallways. The walls seemed to close in around him, tightening like a vice. The figure was still there, looming just behind him, its presence suffocating. "You see," the figure said, its voice full of pity, "there's no escaping. This is your reality now. This is your prison, and the only way out is to face yourself, to face the truth of who you are." Evan's heart raced in his chest. He couldn't stand it anymore. He had tried everything. He had opened every door, tried every escape, but it was always the same. No matter where he went, no matter how many times he turned around, the same cruel reality was always waiting for him. "What do you want from me?" Evan screamed, his voice raw with frustration and pain. "Why won't you let me go?" The figure remained silent for a moment before it spoke again, its voice softer now, almost coaxing. "I'm not the one holding you here, Evan. You are." The words hit him like a slap to the face. He staggered back, his mind reeling as the full weight of the figure's words sank in. He was the one who had created this place, wasn't he? He had built this corridor with his fears, his regrets, his failures. He had locked himself in this prison with no way out. "You can never outrun yourself," the figure repeated, its voice almost affectionate. "You've been running from your own darkness for so long that you've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten what you've become." Evan staggered, his knees buckling beneath him. The ground felt unstable beneath his feet, as if the very foundation of the corridor was crumbling. He was trapped in a maze, but it was a maze of his own making. A maze of guilt and shame. A maze he couldn't escape. "I'm not like you," Evan whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked up at the figure, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "I don't want to be like you." The figure smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "But you are. You've always been." Evan's breath caught in his throat. The world around him started to twist, the walls warping and stretching, as if the entire hallway was becoming one with his mind, a reflection of his inner turmoil. The light flickered, casting strange, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. Everything felt wrong, like the very fabric of reality was falling apart. "No," Evan murmured, shaking his head. "No, I'm not. I'm not like you. I'm not a monster." The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. "You think you're not a monster? You think you're any different from me? You've been hiding from the truth for so long that you've forgotten what you've become. You've allowed yourself to be consumed by your own guilt, your own fear. That's why you're here. That's why you'll always be here." Evan's chest tightened, and his mind spun faster, the words feeling like daggers in his heart. He wasn't ready to hear this. He didn't want to face it. But the truth was undeniable. He had tried to escape. He had tried to outrun the darkness, to shut it out, to lock it away. But it had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting to break through. The more he tried to hide from it, the stronger it became. The more he ignored it, the deeper it took root inside him. He had been running from himself, from the mistakes he couldn't undo, from the guilt that weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. And now it was all here, laid bare in front of him. There was no hiding from it anymore. No more doors to open. No more illusions to hide behind. The figure reached out, placing a hand on Evan's shoulder. The touch was cold, icy even, sending a jolt of fear through Evan's spine. "Face it, Evan," the figure whispered. "You'll never escape from what you are. You'll never escape from yourself." Evan could feel the darkness welling up inside him. The truth was there, standing in front of him, staring him in the face. There was no escape. He had created this hell for himself, and now he had to face it. For the first time, Evan didn't try to run. He didn't try to hide. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of his own guilt, his own darkness, crash down on him like a tidal wave. He had created this corridor. He had created the nightmare. And now there was no running. There was no escape. He was trapped in this place. Forever. Evan stood motionless, unable to tear his gaze away from the figure that loomed before him. His mind swirled with the endless truth that had finally caught up to him. He had spent so long running, avoiding, denying it. But now the truth was undeniable, and it threatened to consume him whole. The figure smiled again, its eyes cold and unfeeling. It was him, or rather, it was the version of him that he feared the most. The part of him that he had buried so deep within himself. The part that represented everything he hated and wished to forget. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a manifestation of his guilt, his shame, his regrets. "You still don't understand, do you?" the figure asked, its voice low and mocking. "You think you can escape it. You think you can outsmart yourself. But the truth is, there's nowhere to run. You are stuck here, and you will never be free." Evan's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the figure's words settled into him. He had known it all along, hadn't he? That's why he'd been running. Because he couldn't face the truth. He couldn't face what he had become. The lies, the mistakes, the things he had done in the past, they were all here now, in this never-ending nightmare. "I'm not like you," Evan whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not a monster. I'm not you." The figure laughed softly, the sound empty and hollow. "Of course you are. You've been running from yourself for so long, hiding in your own lies. But deep down, you know what you've done. You know what you've become." The darkness around them seemed to press closer, the hallway stretching out endlessly in all directions. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Evan's heartbeat quickened, his hands trembling at his sides. "No," he gasped, taking a step back. "I can't be you. I won't be you. I refuse to be you." But the figure wasn't listening. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each footfall echoing in the silent corridor. "You don't get it, Evan," the figure said, its voice quieter now, almost sorrowful. "You can run. You can scream. You can deny it all you want. But you will never escape yourself. You'll never outrun your past. You'll never outrun who you really are." Evan's mind spun in a whirl of confusion and panic. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare. But the more he struggled, the more he realized that there was no escape. No matter how many doors he opened, no matter how many times he tried to run, he was always going to end up here, back in the same hallway, back in front of the same version of himself. And it was only getting worse. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Evan shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Why can't you just let me go?" The figure reached out, its hand cold against Evan's skin. "Because, Evan, you can never truly let go of yourself. You can never run from the truth. The only way out is through it. You must face what you've become. You must face who you are." Evan's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stood over him, its eyes piercing through him like cold knives. There was no escape from it. There was no escape from the truth. For a moment, everything went silent. The pounding in Evan's chest, the suffocating darkness around him, all of it seemed to stop. And then, a new sound filled the air. A soft, unsettling noise, like a whisper in the darkness. It grew louder, growing more urgent with every passing second. Evan's heart stopped as the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The whispers weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from the doors, from the other rooms, the rooms he had tried to escape to, the ones he had opened and shut so many times. He stood up shakily, his eyes wide with terror, and turned toward the nearest door. He could hear the whispers clearly now, growing louder and louder, as if the very walls were alive with them. He opened the door, and it was him again, the same version of himself. No, it wasn't possible. But the figure spoke again, its voice low and menacing. "You've opened the door. You've invited them in. And now, you're never going to leave." Evan slammed the door shut and stumbled backward. The whispers were everywhere. The doors were opening. More of him, more versions of him, stepping out into the corridor, surrounding him. Each one had the same hollow eyes, the same twisted smile. Each one whispered the same things. You can't escape. You're one of us now. Your darkness is ours. Evan backed into the wall, his breath ragged and panicked. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, and the versions of him kept coming, filling the space with their distorted forms. They filled the hallway with their voices, their cold, mocking laughter, their accusations. There's no way out, one of them hissed. You're trapped, another whispered. This is where you belong, another said softly. The walls closed in, the hallway growing smaller and smaller as the figures pressed in around him, suffocating him with their presence. Evan's mind was spinning, his thoughts fractured and chaotic. He was losing control, losing his grip on reality. The whispers grew louder, their voices crashing over him like waves. The figures closed in, surrounding him, pressing in until there was nowhere left to go. He was trapped in a maze of his own mind, surrounded by endless versions of himself. His own fears, his own darkness. And the worst part was, he knew they were right. He couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. The last thing he heard was the echoing laughter of the figures, their voices blending together into one overwhelming chorus. And then, the world went black. The darkness was all-encompassing, a suffocating void that swallowed him whole. Evan couldn't tell if his eyes were closed, or if there was just nothing left to see. The whispers had faded, but the weight of their presence lingered, like a thick fog clinging to his mind. How long had it been? Seconds? Minutes? Hours? Time no longer seemed to matter. Nothing made sense anymore. He had lost track of reality, and all he could feel was the heavy, suffocating grip of his own guilt wrapping around him like a noose. Then a light appeared. It was faint at first, a tiny speck in the distance, but it grew larger, brighter, until it engulfed everything. Evan flinched, his body instinctively pulling away from the light. But there was nowhere to hide. It was everywhere, and it was all he could see. The light seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife, blinding him. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from the silence. He couldn't remember how he had gotten here. He couldn't remember what had happened to the corridor, to the figures. All he could remember was the overwhelming feeling of being trapped, of being swallowed whole by the maze of his own mind. But as the light grew brighter, something else began to take shape. A figure, a shadow. It moved toward him, slow at first, then faster, until it was right in front of him. It was the figure again, the one that had haunted him in the corridor, the one that had whispered those terrible truths to him. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a twisted reflection of himself. It was something more, something darker. "You still don't get it, do you?" the figure said, its voice cold and mocking. Evan stumbled backward, panic surging through him once more. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Please, not again. I can't do this anymore." The figure smiled, the same twisted smile that had haunted him from the beginning. "You've never really understood who you are, Evan. You've spent your whole life running from it. But you can't escape yourself. You can't escape the truth." Evan closed his eyes, trying to block out the figure's words. But the voice was inside his head now, echoing in his skull, a constant drumbeat that drowned out everything else. The figure's words were undeniable, and with each passing second, Evan felt himself sinking deeper into the abyss. "I'm not like you," Evan whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm not a monster." The figure's smile grew wider, its eyes narrowing in amusement. "You keep saying that, but deep down, you know the truth. You've always known. You've been hiding from it for so long, and now it's time to face it." Evan shook his head desperately, trying to push the figure away, to make it disappear. No, I don't want to face it. I don't want to be you. I don't want to be trapped in this nightmare." But the figure stepped closer, its cold hand reaching out to touch Evan's face. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of panic through his body. "It's not a nightmare, Evan. This is real. This is who you are. You can't escape it. Not now. Not ever. The walls around them seemed to bend and warp, stretching like rubber. The light grew more blinding, and the floor beneath Evan's feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. He felt his mind begin to crack, the pressure building until he thought he might collapse under the weight of it. But then something inside him shifted. A spark of defiance. A flicker of resistance. He wasn't sure where it came from, but it was there, deep inside him. He wasn't ready to give up yet. No, Evan said, his voice growing steadier. I'm not you. I won't be you. The figure's smile faltered, just for a moment. But it didn't stop. It didn't back down. You can say that all you want, Evan. But it's too late. You've already let me in. You've already become me. Evan took a step back, his body shaking, but his will burning brighter. He couldn't let it happen. Not like this. Not after everything he had already been through. He had spent too long running from his own demons, hiding from the truth. But now, for the first time, he was ready to confront them. I won't let you win, Evan said, his voice low but resolute. The figure's eyes narrowed, and the room around them seemed to grow darker, colder. But Evan didn't back down. He focused on the light, on the spark inside him, and he felt the darkness around him begin to recede. You think you can escape? The figure hissed. You can't escape me. You can't escape yourself. But Evan wasn't listening anymore. He could feel the truth now coursing through him. He wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But that didn't mean he had to let those mistakes define him. He wasn't trapped in the corridor. He wasn't trapped in the darkness of his own guilt. He had a choice. He always had a choice. With a cry, Evan pushed forward, focusing on the light, on the truth that he had been hiding from for so long. And as he did, the figure seemed to recoil, its form flickering, distorting, like a reflection in broken glass. No, the figure spat, its voice cracking. You can't escape. But Evan didn't stop. The light grew brighter, more powerful, and with each step he took, the figure's form began to dissolve, its presence fading into nothingness. You're not real, Evan said, his voice steady. You never were. And then, with one final burst of energy, the figure disappeared completely. The darkness lifted. The suffocating air cleared. Evan stood in the light, breathing deeply, his body trembling, but his mind clear for the first time in what felt like forever. He was free. Evan stood there for a long moment, the light surrounding him like a soft embrace. His heart still raced, his body still trembling from the fear that had gripped him just moments before. But the overwhelming presence of the figure, the twisted reflection of himself, was gone. And with its departure, the corridor, the endless hallway, the whispers, all of it seemed to fade. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. He had faced the darkness within himself, confronted the fears that had haunted him for so long, and he had come out the other side. He wasn't the same person as before. The weight of his past was still there, but it no longer held him captive. Evan turned around, the walls of the hallway stretching out in front of him. The once oppressive, claustrophobic space now seemed more open. The light that filled the room wasn't blinding anymore. It was warm, soothing. It felt like a promise of something new, something better. He didn't know where the hallway led, but he knew that he didn't need to be afraid anymore. He took a tentative step forward, his legs still shaky but determined. With each step, the light seemed to grow stronger, more vibrant. The darkness no longer pressed in on him. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, the weight of the past lifting with every movement. Evan walked forward, his breath slowly calming, his heartbeat returning to a more natural rhythm. He didn't know what was waiting for him at the end of the corridor, but it didn't matter. He was no longer trapped in the endless loop of fear and guilt. He was no longer running from himself. As he walked, he began to notice something. The doors, the ones that had once held such terror, were different now. They weren't dark, foreboding. They didn't whisper his name. didn't promise more of the same endless torment. They were simply doors, and for the first time, he felt like he had the choice to open one. Each door represented a different possibility, a different future. Some were slightly ajar, others closed tight, but none of them felt like traps anymore. They weren't part of the maze. They were just doors. Evan reached out and opened one. It wasn't the same as before. There was no figure behind it, no twisted version of himself waiting to greet him with that mocking smile. It was a room, plain and ordinary, but it wasn't empty. It was a space filled with quiet calm, the kind of peace Evan hadn't known for a long time. The walls were bare, the floor clean and polished. It felt safe. He stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing softly in the quiet room. He didn't need to look back. He had stepped into this new space, and he knew that this was his choice. He wasn't running anymore. He was facing forward, but as he moved deeper into the room, he felt a strange unease. Something wasn't quite right. The air around him grew colder. The warmth from the hallway seemed to dissipate, replaced by a chill that nipped at his skin. It wasn't freezing, but it was enough to make him shiver. His heart began to race again, and his mind flickered back to the hallway, to the endless corridor he had just escaped. No, he couldn't go back there. He had come so far, and yet the room around him seemed to shift. The walls, once plain and clean, began to blur. The floor started to warp, bending beneath his feet. He reached out for something to steady himself, but his hands met only the cold, empty air. Something was wrong. The whispers started again, faint at first, like a distant murmur. But they grew louder, growing into a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, all accusing, mocking, whispering things he didn't want to hear. Evan stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The door he had just entered was now gone. The room had disappeared, leaving him in a void, surrounded by the same darkness that had trapped him before. "No," he whispered, panic rising in his chest. "I thought I was free. I thought I—" But before he could finish the thought, a figure appeared before him. It wasn't the same figure. Not exactly. This one was different. It was familiar, but it wasn't. It was a version of himself, but it was older. The face was more lined, the eyes harder, colder. And there was something else. A deep sadness in the eyes that seemed to reach into Evan's very soul. "Evan," the figure said softly, its voice cracked and hollow. "You can't escape. You can't ever escape." Evan's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to turn away, to run, but the figure's eyes held him in place. The sadness in them was suffocating, overwhelming. It was a mirror of everything Evan had tried to bury, everything he had been running from. "I don't want this," Evan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to go back. Please, I just want to be free." The figure stepped forward, its presence like a weight pressing down on him. "There is no freedom, Evan. Not for you. Not for anyone. You can try to run, but you'll always end up here. In this place. With me. With yourself." Evan shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, no. I'm not you. I'm not trapped anymore. I won't be." But the figure's hand reached out, cold as ice, and Evan felt it touch his chest. The touch was almost comforting, but at the same time, it sent a chill down his spine. "You are me," the figure said, its voice soft but unyielding. "And I am you. We are one, and we will always be." Evan gasped, his body trembling as the truth seemed to settle in, heavy and undeniable. He had thought he could escape. He had thought he could outrun the darkness. But now here it was, staring him in the face once again. And for the first time, Evan realized something. Maybe the real freedom wasn't in running. Maybe it was in accepting that the darkness was a part of him. Accepting that it would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind. He could never escape it, but he could learn to live with it. He could choose not to let it control him. Evan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He wasn't going to fight anymore. He wasn't going to let the fear consume him. He was ready to face the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step to truly being free. Evan stood in the dark room, the figure before him, an older version of himself, fading in and out of focus. Its voice echoed in his mind, and the weight of its words felt like a chain dragging him down. "We are one," it had said, "and we will always be." For a moment, Evan wanted to deny it. He wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but the words stuck to him like a thick, oppressive fog. The fear he had pushed down for so long began to bubble back to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him again. But then something shifted. A strange clarity washed over him, like a light cutting through the darkness. He realized the figure, the version of himself that stood before him, wasn't his enemy. It was a reflection, a part of him he had always tried to ignore. The darkness in him had been growing, festering, feeding on his fear. But it was his darkness, and only he had the power to face it. "Maybe you're right," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but with a newfound steadiness. "Maybe I can't escape it, but I don't have to be afraid of it anymore." The figure looked at him, its eyes narrowing, almost as if it didn't understand. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged forward, its cold hand reaching for Evan's throat. But Evan didn't flinch. He stood firm, eyes locked with the figure's, feeling the chill of its touch. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He let the figure come closer, let it touch him, let it engulf him, because deep down, he knew it wasn't the figure he feared. It was what the figure represented, his own insecurities, his guilt, his past mistakes. And for the first time, Evan felt a strange sense of peace. He had spent so long running from this darkness, trying to escape it, trying to bury it. But now he understood. He couldn't outrun it, no matter how far he ran. He couldn't deny it, no matter how much he tried. It was a part of him, and it always would be. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breath, and let the figure's cold grip tighten around him. The darkness swirled around him, suffocating, consuming. But instead of fighting, he embraced it. He let it fill him, fill every corner of his being. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The darkness wasn't something to be feared. It wasn't something that had control over him. It was just a part of him. And by facing it, by accepting it, he could free himself from the chains it had placed on him. The figure's grip loosened, and the darkness began to recede, like a shadow retreating before the light. Evan opened his eyes, and the room around him was no longer cold and oppressive. The walls weren't warping, and the floor didn't seem to be bending beneath him. The space was calm, peaceful. The fear that had gripped him for so long was gone. The figure before him began to fade, its form dissolving like smoke, until all that was left was the echo of its voice. "You are free, Evan, but you will always carry me with you." Evan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the words settle in. He would always carry the darkness within him, but it no longer had the power to control him. It was part of who he was, but it didn't define him. He could choose how to move forward. He could choose not to be consumed by it. He turned and walked towards the door that had appeared behind him. It was a simple wooden door, nothing special, but it felt like a new beginning, a chance to start over, to leave the endless corridor behind. He opened it, stepping into the light. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Evan took a deep breath, feeling the cool, fresh air fill his lungs. He was outside. He had made it. The building, the endless hallways, the twisted versions of himself, they were all behind him. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer had the same grip on him. He had faced it. He had confronted it. And now he could walk away. The light outside was blinding at first, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw the world spread out before him. The sky was vast, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the darkness he had just escaped. But even as Evan looked around, he knew that this peace, this freedom, wasn't permanent. He would have to continue facing the darkness within himself. There would always be challenges, moments where the past would try to pull him back. But he was ready now. He had learned that he wasn't trapped in an endless corridor. He wasn't trapped in his own mind. He had the power to walk away. And with that realization, Evan stepped forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next.